Hi, and welcome to our forum on climate change as a class issue. This is a forum that's being sponsored by the Eco-Socialist Network, Global Eco-Socialist Network, and Mark's Mail. My name is Paul LeBlanc, and I'm a member of Global Eco-Socialist Network. And our speakers this evening are Sarah Glynn and John Clarke. Sarah is a writer currently based in Strasbourg, where she works with the Kurdish freedom movement. As a political activist, she has also been particularly involved in campaigns with unemployed workers and with tenants. She has worked as an architect and as a university lecturer in human geography. John Clarke was an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty for 28 years and is now a member of 230 Fight Back, an organization campaigning for social housing in Toronto's downtown east. He writes for various publications and facilitates a Fighting to Win course for union and community activists. Sarah and John co-authored an excellent booklet entitled Climate Change as a Class Issue, and folks can get a copy of it, a free copy of it through email and online. But in any event, without any further ado, let's start with our speakers. Sarah?
So thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody, for inviting us, and really look forward to the discussion. And it's almost a year that's gone by since we sent our little book out into the world. And it's really sobering to observe how in that time climate change, this existential threat to human existence, has slipped further down the political agenda. It's ignored by governments that think only of competition, both economic and military. But among activists too, environmental concerns have been pushed aside by the immediate horror of genocide and by our desperate attempts to set a moral compass for complicit international leaders. We've been experiencing a relentless progression of weeks where decades happen, and it's impossible to keep track of all the world-changing events that take place every day, but of course they're linked. Our little book focused on the links between the exploitation of workers and the exploitation in a general sense of nature by a capitalist world that regards everything as a source of profit. War made only a relatively brief appearance, but it's those same capitalist forces that are driving the deadly imperialist competition that's bringing our world to a new precipice of insanity. It's not by chance that governments that preside over increasing economic inequality also run roughshod over ecological concerns and are ready to kill to impose their will. In this reign of greed, our leaders are even ready to ignore the future of their own grandchildren. Today's wars, the debilitating inequality and increasing oppression, and the threat of ecological collapse all have their origin in the logic of capitalism, in the hegemonic belief that greed, in Gordon Gekko's famous phrase from Wall Street, is good. For those who want to believe in a future, the positive news is that all our struggles are linked and boost each other. The bad news is that we face a formidable opponent. Capitalism may seem to be collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, but it could take us all down with it. Many have found themselves quoting Gramsci's words from nearly a century ago. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. This turbulence doesn't only bring fear for the future and nourishment for fascist dictators. It's easy to forget amid our worries that it also creates possibilities for positive change. It's never been more important to be able to grab those possibilities and build on them. However, if we're to succeed in this, we on the left need to be much better organized. Our wee book or booklet was conceived of as a tool that can help play a part, however small, in building that organization. It grew out of the understanding that the working class remains the one force that can bring about the system change needed for the survival of humanity, and that the ecological struggle is inextricably linked to the social struggle. It was a response to the realization that despite this, the great majority of writing on climate change and ecological issues more generally is addressed to a middle-class audience and ignores both working-class concerns and working-class struggle. I don't imagine speaking to a meeting of eco-socialists that I'll be saying anything with which you're not already very familiar, but I hope this brief outline will serve as an introduction that can allow us to discuss what is to be done. So I'll start with the question of why climate change is a class issue, and not just climate change, but ecological sustainability as a whole. I don't like using the term sustainability because while its literal meaning describes precisely what is needed, it's been hijacked by those who promote green capitalism and green growth. And endless growth, which is the motor of capitalism, is inherently unsustainable. Put simply, you can't continue to devour resources on a finite planet without causing life-changing destruction. Most obviously and frequently commented on, the wealthiest class is responsible for much the greatest part of carbon dioxide production and environmental degradation. This is not only the result of personal consumption, but also of the short-sightedly selfish decisions they make in how to invest their wealth. In addition, for now at least, the wealthy are generally able to buy themselves protection for the consequences of their action. To make the situation worse, capitalist governments regard climate change in the same way as they regard everything else, as a business opportunity. And like other disasters, climate change is used as an opportunity to take back social gains won by previous generations. Similar exploitation is happening on an international scale, increasing inequalities between and within states. And so-called green capitalism is opening up new opportunities for exploitation. Inequality and environmental degradation go hand in hand because both are the products of the capitalist system, which sees everything in terms of potential profit. We are locked into an economic system that does not work in the service of society, but instead feeds the short-term interests of a small elite. It is also a system whose constant appetite for raw materials and markets is driving an increasingly dangerous escalation of imperialist competition and war. That this system is leading us towards greater and even more brutal inequality and potential extinction is blatant and clear for all to see. So how is our intelligent species letting that happen? Inequalities of wealth are reflected in inequalities of power, but that is only a partial explanation. Economic systems are sustained by their supporting ideology, so understanding how that ideology is being used to mislead us is a vital step towards changing the system. A crucial capitalist myth is that the system is not man-made, but natural and unchangeable, reflecting humanity's innate selfishness. It's a depressing view of the world that happily bears little resemblance to reality. If we were actually the selfish creatures the capitalists depict, human society would never have got off the ground. Humanity's strength comes from our ability to organize together and help each other. Capitalist propaganda would also have us believe that our survival depends on ever-increasing GDP, but it's not humanity that depends on this, it's capitalism itself. We are made to be fearful of change and to regard any constraints on exploitation as a tax on freedom. We're told there's no money available for the public good, even while we're surrounded by the wealth created by generations and while technical developments take productivity to ever higher levels. We've been conditioned by capitalism to reject higher taxes and public spending, though if we want a rational world with democratic control over the economy, these are vital tools. Most people spend most of their time tied to the capitalist treadmill that deprives them of both the time and inclination to think beyond capitalist expectations. We use energy and resources to make more and more stuff that adds very little to human well-being, and we use our ingenuity to persuade others that this stuff is the key to their future happiness. We can never be happy with what we have, or we wouldn't buy more. We work long hours, often on what David Graeber described as bullshit jobs, which we can perceive are intrinsically pointless, and then we're persuaded to spend our hard-won earnings on things that might save us a bit of time or seem to replace a bit of lost joy. Most jobs do not contribute much to humanity, but workers doing those jobs are dependent on them for a living. They can't afford to see their livelihood disappear. Capitalists exploit the fear of unemployment like they always do. They use this fear to make people resistant to any change that would see these jobs go. However, a sustainable social system requires work too, just different work. Such a system can pay people to do the work that their community decides is important, and it can ensure through a fairer distribution of resources that everyone has enough to live on and enough time to enjoy life. We know that another way of running things is possible and that it could work. The problem, of course, is how to get there. Without the power of the united working class to force change, including through the planned withdrawal of labour, we will remain trapped in capitalism's road to destruction. It is workers who have the power, and also workers who have knowledge and skills that can be turned towards creating a different way of doing things. Competition and the drive for endless growth needs to be replaced by prioritization of human need, including the needs of future generations. The exploitation of both people and nature needs to be replaced by an understanding of human society as part of a natural ecosystem that has to be nurtured. Our limited resources need to be shared more equally and used more rationally. This can be achieved by using public funding to provide public goods and services and genuinely useful work, and by using taxes to reduce inequalities and to allow everyone to benefit from efficiencies of production and from the wealth built up by past generations. Undoubtedly, there is not yet popular support for all the changes that are needed, but this support can be built up through the struggle for smaller changes that are both beneficial in themselves and that can help people see the necessity and possibility of more radical change. Organized struggles to change government policy and economic practice are reinforced by the local actions of community-based mutual aid organizations. These help with daily life and also provide a living model of a different way of approaching the economy and of inclusive democratic structures. Local action can change lives and attitudes, but it can't substitute for the power of the organized working class. We need both. People easily forget about the public services that we already have, which were won through struggle in the past and which are now just taken for granted. These demonstrate the need and the practicality of moving away from relying on the market. Of course, these services have often been far from perfect, but their problems generally result from lack of investment and from centralized bureaucratic management. They're not caused by the underlying principle of public ownership, which needs to be controlled by its users and well funded. Goals for moving towards a new social economy, an economy for people and society and not for profit and GDP, would include job guarantees in socially useful work and progressive taxation, including tax on wealth. It's no use trying to change behavior through subsidy bribes or through green taxes that tend to penalize the worst off. Our future needs to be protected by strong environmental regulation. To achieve these aims, we need an invigorated trade union movement that's ready to take a proactive and forward-looking stance, and community organization that's not afraid to embrace the political dimension. In the book, I look at two examples. In Liverpool, residents of Granby Four Streets combined community gardening and mutual aid with more traditional campaigning to save their homes from demolition, strengthening their local community and demonstrating the power of community organization. In Florence, what began in July 2021 as a factory occupation against threatened closure and the layoff of over 400 auto parts workers has developed into a mass movement that brings together different struggles for a better way of living in society. Even if they don't ultimately succeed in turning their factory into a not-for-profit workers' cooperative, making cargo bikes and solar panels, which is what they want to do, the workers are manufacturing a new politics. Each change achieved in the ecological struggle through forcing new legislation or by direct community action, they seem very small compared to the enormity of what is needed. But one change can also make the next change easier. Together, they can be greater than the sum of their parts and open our eyes to new possibilities. Living examples of inclusive democratic practice and mutual aid are more convincing than essays, and every well-planned public investment demonstrates the hollowness of capitalist scare stories. So I hope in the discussion that you'll be able to introduce us to lots more examples, but I'll now hand over to John to talk about the practicalities of political activism in a time of climate crisis.
I'll try in what I say to avoid being repetitious, although Sarah and I are obviously fairly like-minded on these questions, so a little bit of repetition may be unavoidable. I wanted to begin by stressing that I myself came into considerations of climate change via the class struggle, in the sense that I'd been involved in, I've been a trade union activist, and then later found myself organizing in poor working class communities that were under attack. And so I'd been involved in active mobilizing and struggling and campaigning over a long period of time. And it became increasingly clear to me that climate change was something that had an enormous impact on people living in poverty, on working class people. And I found myself coming into being much more interested in making those links and making those connections. And hence I ended up working on this with Sarah. There were a number of things that I wanted to try to stress as I was making my contribution to the book. And the first of these was, if we're talking about class struggle in any meaningful sense, we're talking about challenging capitalism. And it struck me that an anti-capitalist viewpoint, an eco-socialist viewpoint, was essential if we are to move forward in addressing the question of climate change. Because precisely, we are dealing with a social and economic system that has demonstrated very, very clearly that it is incapable of creating a sustainable relationship with the natural world. And that's worsening. That John Bellaby Foster suggests that the Anthropocene started in the 1950s, and he may well be right, but we're further down the road than we were at that time. Things are looking very, very severe. Today, they have unleashed a veritable Pandora's box in terms of the productive power and the technology, without being able to use it in a way that takes into account a sustainable relationship with nature, to the point that you have now people talking about what oil and gas projects they can build, even as it's quite clear that the polar ice caps are melting, and in the case of Canada, the forests are burning, but they're just carrying on regardless. So the destructiveness of this system and the need to change it is the fundamental question that hangs over everything. The second point, however, rather flows from what I was saying at the beginning, which is that the crisis of climate change and the broader ecological crisis that it is part of really plays out just as the pandemic did. It travels down the fault lines of social, racial, and global inequality to a degree that becomes ever clearer. And so climate change is something that has to be challenged on that basis. It's true that in the end, it catches up with us all, even the wealthy and the privileged. But at this particular point, we can see that people in Silicon Valley are able to make their arrangements and able to survive, whereas the people who are facing the floods in Pakistan are being absolutely devastated by the experience. Hence, there is a link between issue of the class struggle and climate change. A number of years ago, I was involved in one of these discussions, and a climate activist came on who sort of talked in terms of climate as a kind of a moral crusade. that there was it was just an issue that was just, and we should all, as self-respecting human beings, want to develop a campaign around climate change. But when he was asked about, ordinary people and how that might impact them, he didn't really have much to say. It didn't really occur to him that the effects of climate change on people in the workplaces, on people trying to go about their daily lives to survive, people living in hard-pressed communities where public services have already been gutted. It didn't occur to him that was much of an issue. But to me, it's the issue. If we're going to challenge climate change, it won't be that some relatively discerning middle-class people feel that it's a valid moral issue. It's going to be we're going to have to see working-class people mobilized to use their collective strength, to use their power. So the class struggle and climate change do flow together at this particular time with an incredible force. When it comes to how we're going to have to address it, it seems to me that there are two levels. Ultimately, of course, we must change society. Ultimately, we must end capitalism. But I have to reluctantly admit that isn't an immediate agenda item, although I'm always hopeful that it can be moved up rapidly. But I think that what we see is a situation where we have to build movements that can actually affect what is happening to a much greater extent than we've already been able to do. And that means, on the one hand, we must stay the hand of the destructive interests to the greatest degree possible. We can't have a perspective of, and I used to be guilty of this. I used to think, yes, climate change is real. I'm not saying it isn't, but we'll have socialism and then it'll all be put right. And it's much more serious than that. If we're going to survive, we have to stop what they're doing to a very significant degree in the short term. And so that does mean actually demanding the curtailing of emissions. It does actually mean fighting for transition, but it means fighting for just transition. It means fighting for a transition that meets the needs of working class people, and that's the basis, I think, on which we're going to mobilize people. That's the basis on which we're going to make a difference. So yes, we have to address, to do all in our power to ensure that their assets are left in the ground, that destructive forms of activity are changed differently, are conducted differently. In Oshawa, close to Toronto, not to be confused with Ottawa, the capital city of Toronto. In Oshawa, a General Motors plant was closing. And a Green Jobs Oshawa initiative was started that very, very interestingly, ultimately they didn't succeed, but they took up a vigorous campaign to try to ensure that ecologically useful activity was engaged in that plant and that it was taken into public ownership. And it was a very, very vigorous and important campaign that I think points to something, because the form of the class struggle has to change in this situation. We can't have a situation where unions accept that management decides what's produced, when it's produced, if it's produced, and our job is just to negotiate better wages and working conditions under the system that exists. We have to actually be prepared to see the class struggle as an attempt to influence what is being produced, how it's being produced to the greatest possible degree. And then flowing out of that is the absolutely decisive immediate question, and that is the impacts of climate change that are playing out in people's lives, because the class struggle in some ways is going to be shaped by that experience. A short while ago, we saw the flooding in Valencia in Spain. And people may recall, I found it quite delightful to watch the King of Spain showing up, hoping to offer some platitudes, and he got pelted with mud by the people in the crowd, and they feel raw, important working class anger in that situation. And so I think that we're going to have to be in this period in the workplace, organizing to ensure that people are protected from the impacts of climate change. You see delivery workers in many places now organizing to try to deal with the heat that they're facing, the extreme heat that they're facing in their jobs. You're going to see a million examples of that kind of thing in the workplace and in communities. At the moment, there's no real plan to deal with the escalating impacts of climate change. The extreme weather, the storms, the floods, the wildfires, all these things, communities face devastation, and there's nothing there to deal with it. So we're going to have to organize to demand the protections and the capacity to rebuild and those kinds of things that if we don't do it, communities will be abandoned in this situation. So the class struggle in that sense becomes very raw in the impact of climate change. And I'd just like to finally make this observation because it's sort of really sharpened since we wrote the thing. And that is that at the time we were putting the booklet out, the myth of green capitalism was the hand that was being played to a much greater extent than it is at the moment. We were seeing corporate CEOs talking about climate change is very real, and we swear we're going to change, and we're doing all these things, and we have these wonderful initiatives. And it was sort of obligatory to say green things, even as you destroyed the planet. But they've sort of thrown caution to the winds at this point. The second Trump administration has been a sort of an emboldening point for them, and they're just going forward cheerfully disregarding or denying climate change. You have Trump's energy secretary now saying that climate change, yes, it exists, but it's a manageable problem, and it's just the price you pay for living in the modern world, and we need to be producing more oil and gas. In Canada, you have a liberal prime minister at the moment, but he is now giving the green light to oil and gas projects that are going to be vastly destructive. So we're dealing with an even more virulent enemy than we were when the booklet came out. So I think the link between the class struggle and climate change is absolutely undeniable, and I hope we can have an interesting discussion based on that. Thank you very much.
Now it's time for our discussion. And there is, this is one of the most important components of this whole forum. There are sharp questions I would like to pose, but I'm not going to do that right now. But I'm hoping that some of you will pose sharp questions and give some information on some of your experience. So I'm going to take 3 or 4 folks to make comments or ask questions. Then we'll go to John and Sarah, have them respond, and then we'll do that again and again. So now, is there anyone who would like to make a comment or pose a question? Yes, Michael, and then Ted. Go ahead.
Well, let me first thank Sarah and John for this very, very coherent and persuasive introduction. I think you are absolutely right to point the connection between climate change and class struggle, and the conclusion that we cannot get rid of the capitalist system without the working class. Yeah, we all agree on that. But I think we have to take into account the fact that today there are other groups who really don't fit into the classic definition of working class, who are on the front line of the struggle against climate change, against oil, gas, destruction of the forest, etc. Starting with Canada, the indigenous communities trying to prevent tar sand oil of being exploited in Canada. It's a decisive issue, not only for Canada, but for humanity. And if we go to the south, to Latin America, we see the indigenous communities, the small peasants, etc., playing. They are on the front line, to defend the Amazon. Unfortunately, it's not the unions who are fighting to defend the Amazon; it's the indigenous communities and the peasants, etc., and the base communities, and so on. So, and on a more global scale, there are groups like youth, people around Greta Thunberg, some of them may be of working class origin, but it's not a working class struggle. Yeah? It's youth as such who is mobilizing on board scale. And women, women which are present in the struggle. Some of them belong to the working class, but not all, etc. So there are specific factors concerning women as such, youth as such, and etc. So we have to have a broader understanding of the subject of the struggle against capitalism and climate change. We cannot just say it's the working class. Of course, the working class is decisive, and without the working class, we won't be able to do the job. But we have to take into account the fact that today, the groups who are most active in this struggle, unfortunately, are not the unions, are not the classic organized working class, there are other groups.
Ted?
Okay, well, thank you, Sarah, and John, and also thank you, Michael. I live in Bogota, Colombia, and I believe Michael for a while lived in Brazil. So here, the vice president of the country made her political reputation as an environmentalist in those community organizations of Afro-Colombians on the coast of this country. They have a left-wing government that has banned fracking in this country, that has stopped coal exports to Israel, that has recognized the Palestinian state. One of the two most important unions in this country is the Oil Workers Union. This country produces more oil than Venezuela. Most people don't know it. The Oil Workers Union was against fracking. Now they're for fracking. They just held a very important forum on September 6th on the transition from fossil fuel to alternative forms of energy. And at that forum, they and the leaders of Ecopetrol, the state-owned oil company, under President Gustavo Petro, who was in favor of phasing out fossil fuel, said, well, we probably have to start fracking because we're going to build $1 billion refinery in the oil capital of the country, Blanc, and we won't have any oil to refine. And the communities along in the valley of the Rio Magdalena, where there are lots of oil workers, have changed their politics on this issue. So there's a big problem of a divide in the working class here and in the indigenous Afro-Colombian and communities of poor rural people who want jobs in the oil industry, which pay well. They don't want to stop drilling. They want to drill more. And the unions and the government have not answered this yet. So this is a problem that has to be addressed. And John was talking about the Green Job campaign in Oshawa, Ontario. That's a good kind of thing. Here, the government has a program of alternative energy, building wind farms, building solar farms, and it has failed to develop the way it was supposed to because of political opposition from, mostly from the political right wing. Okay, so I'm posing a problem, of addressing this kind of issue, because this issue is not limited to Colombia. You look at North Sea oil and gas. What about those workers? The workers in those industries have to have a solution in a transition to green jobs. But you have to fight for it before you close it down. Otherwise, they're going to be against the transition, practically. And that's what's happened here. Okay, I'm interested in comments, especially from the speakers, but from everybody about this practical political issue related to the transition. Because here you have a government in favor and the unions, or at least one important union, against.
Okay, we're with my, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it goes along with some of what has already been stated, problems that we have to deal with. I was under the illusion several years ago that we only had so much time, just a small window to stop catastrophe from happening. I'm beyond that now. The catastrophes, we're not going to stop them. We can't stop them. It will, I agree with John and Sarah, it will take overcoming capitalism to stop them. And we are not going to overcome capitalism anytime real soon. So we have to develop a strategic orientation, I have concluded, that involves trying to win small victories, building consciousness, building organizational skills among a growing number of activists, using things like this wonderful booklet to help generate the kind of consciousness we need, but also understand that the catastrophes are already happening and more are going to happen before there is a shift in consciousness. And so I think we can win small victories right now, but I think that we will not be able to do what I was under the illusion we could do several years ago. That is the conclusion I've come to. So I'm just interested in our speakers and others commenting on that. You know, what is a realistic, practical, strategic orientation and tactical orientation? And Michael and Ted have raised important issues related to that also, and hard issues, tough issues. I would add one final thing, and that is my understanding of what it means to be working class has undergone a shift in recent times. So that the working class is not simply blue-collar workers or factory workers. It is much more expansive. Those of us who have to, in order to survive, we have to sell our ability to work to some employer someplace, and our collar might be blue, or it might be white, or it might be something else. But the majority of people are in that kind of situation, that kind of subordinate situation. And it's our lives, our work and our lives that make the system possible. But not everyone who's part of this expansive working class has the consciousness of that they're part of the working class, and that we're not better than each other. We're all in the same boat, basically. So that's another thought that I have to throw into the mix. Suzanne, and then Mark, and then we'll go on to our speakers.
Okay. I'm speaking as a socialist, as a longtime activist in the climate change issue, and also as a Palestinian supporter for their freedom. I appreciated everything that's been said by Sarah and John and Michael and everybody who has spoken. I'd like to just say that the issue of climate change is intricately connected with the Palestinian struggle for their land. As you know, it's being completely, Gaza is being completely decimated with bombs which do not allow people to breathe, eat, drink, live. And the question of climate change has everything to do with the Palestinian issue. And I'm bringing up the issue of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, because that is a tool that can be used in the climate change component of this crucial world struggle for humanity. As the issue of Palestine and the issue of climate change is intricately connected with the issue of capitalism, imperialism, and we have to address ourselves to that. So I'd like the Sarah and John particularly to talk about the issue of BDS and how we can employ this tool in the struggle against climate change that is for the issue that we are all concerned about, that concerns humanity as well as Palestine. I don't want to go on. Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate and to say a word. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Mark, go ahead, and then John and Sarah, please respond.
So thanks a lot for the book, Sarah and John. And in fact, I put that book on an eco-socialist table that we hosted various events around the Portland and Oregon area. I live in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And at our forum last year, we had a discussion on the roadmap to eco-socialism. And part of that roadmap was a strategy for class struggle. And I think what came out of that discussion, at least for me, was that we need to develop a strategy and tactics for class struggle that address first and foremost fossil capital. Why aren't they paying the damages for the environment? Why are they able to continue to accumulate profits and plow those profits back into buying speakers and politicians and thought leaders in order to forward themselves? So over the past year, since our last forum, I've been involved in what's really pretty much a robust environmental movement in the Pacific Northwest, because we have ports here, and those ports give access to Asia and China. And they want to bring up coal from Wyoming. They want to bring up oil from the Bakken fields and from oil sands. And there is something here we talk about in the Pacific Northwest called the Thin Green Line, where they have stopped it repeatedly. There exactly is. There's one Chevron terminal now that's operating that was not stopped. So in working with these folks, it's interesting. They have a twofold strategy in some of these groups. One, they research the company that's opening it, and they find out economically how robust, how strong is this company, and they develop an economic strategy to wait them out. And the other part of it is mobilizing farmers, indigenous folks, tribal people, and they've been very successful. But what they don't really have is two things. One, a class consciousness, that they're going up against the capitalist industry that's highly centralized, that has enormous resources compared to what we have, because we have a very distributed struggle. So I see this asymmetry here. And I do hope that we can have more of a discussion. Again, the book is great, but I think we need to have more of a discussion on strategy and tactics as well. Thank you.
All right, Sarah and John, over to you.
I mean, there's such a vast quantity of issues that come up that are so important, and I don't know that I can do justice, but I'm going to try to focus on a couple of points. The first point that was made about, you can't just simply say the working class is the force, and there's and to disregard the other elements of the thing. I mean, I think that, I'd accept that as what they call in formal circles a friendly amendment. I mean, I think we're talking about Indigenous people, for example. The role of Indigenous peoples in fighting the issue of climate change is absolutely a critical element. There's absolutely no doubt about that. In the context of Canada right now, the destructive oil and gas projects that they're putting forward are precisely an attack on Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty at the same time. That's going to, and the initial signs of a fight back are coming from Indigenous communities. And it was just a short while ago that, based on their efforts to drive oil and gas pipelines through British Columbia, that there was resistance in this country led by Indigenous people that led to perhaps one of the most impressive mobilizations that points the way forward, where rail lines were closed down and ships were lined up in the Pacific Ocean because they couldn't come in. I mean, there was a real mobilization. It's so, yes, it's not just a sort of the traditional notion of a working class. It's much broader than that, and on a global scale, it's also an anti-imperialist struggle. There's no doubt that all of those things come together. So we are talking about a global movement that is incredibly diverse. But I do make the point, and I don't think people are going to disagree with me, that actually ensuring that the class struggle is directed around the issue of survival of the climate crisis and fighting back, and the use of the strike weapon and such like for those purposes, is going to be an enormously important power that we've got to find the means to unleash. Some points were made about the divisions that exist, and you have situations where you can have union leaderships taking very regressive directions. I don't doubt for a moment that that's true. In fact, I know it to be true. And these are very real. This is not just you have some sort of stodgy conservative union leaderships who haven't got with the program. There are divisions in working class communities that are very, very real. If in the Canadian context, in Alberta, there is a strong sense that oil and gas is the mainstay of the economy. The North Sea oil question comes up on all of these things. There's going to have to be an enormous job done to challenge those. And absolutely, if we're talking about transitioning, it can't be a transitioning that is based on abandonment. It can't be a transitioning that is based on saying, well, sorry, but the oil and gas fields in Alberta have to go, North Sea oil has to go, and all those things, and we'll work it out afterwards. There has to be, any struggle has to be based on a transition that meets the needs of working class communities. So we have to overcome all of those things. In terms of sort of the possibilities for struggle, there's just an element I'd like to introduce, and perhaps this will be the final thing I want to emphasize, is that the indivisibility of the struggles that we are involved in, of which climate change is a part, are very, very clear. Right now, in the Canadian context, we deal with a situation where the trade crisis initiated by the America First turn and protectionism has created something of an existential crisis for Canadian capitalism, in the sense that all of a sudden the major trading partner is demanding a much better deal and behaving in a very harsh fashion. And Carney, the consummate capitalist technocrat, is working on a strategy to essentially impose the burden of that trade crisis on workers and communities. And that involves a whole series of very vicious attacks. The austerity measures that are coming down are going to be virtually unprecedented in the Canadian context. But at the same time, it involves an absolutely reckless drive to expand fossil fuel production in the most dangerous ways. So, and that at the same time constitutes an assault on Indigenous rights. So all of the things come together. I mean, I don't think we're just going to build this sort of like working class climate movement that's off on one side, the impacts of climate change are going to be an elemental part of the whole attack that we're facing. And I think the task is to try to ensure that people have an understanding and movements and organizations base themselves on an understanding that we're fighting for justice on many fronts, but we're not going to be able to fight for justice if we ignore the reality of the fact that they are destroying the basis for life on this planet. And the impacts of that situation are compounding at every point. I think it becomes clearer and clearer. Even if you have a job in the Alberta oil fields, it can't be lost on you that the forests all around you are burning. It can't be lost on you in the fact that Western Canada is in a years-long drought. It can't be lost on you that the impacts of climate change are a very real part of what we're up against. And it can't be lost on you that these bastards are just going to leave us and abandon us in that situation. So I think that the period that opens up gives us enormous possibilities to bring those things together and make the climate struggle a part of the class struggle, but make it part of a much broader struggle too.
Sarah?
Yes, so many things to think about at the same time. I mean, clearly, yes, it was a book that was addressed to a Western working class, and it was never intended to be more than that. But obviously, what's really important is bringing those struggles together, that the class struggles in the West makes links with the indigenous struggles. Well, in Canada, you've got both, but in right across the world, and because the links are there, and the links are there in the economy, so the links need to be there between the peoples and in the struggle. We're obviously doing putting a lot of emphasis on workers and trade unions, and I think one of the things that we really need to be asking is, what needs to be done to make a much stronger, more proactive trade union movement, because at the moment the trade union movement with all these things, it's almost like treating workers just like they don't have agency. They're poor people who are losing their jobs, and actually they need to be seeing them as agents and being more proactive. And like the example John gave, and like the example in Florence, it's the workers themselves can come up with other alternatives to a more green jobs, more green ways of doing things. Those skills of the oil workers can be used elsewhere. And I'm very aware, I used to live in Scotland, so I'm very aware of a place where, the most trained people are working in oil. And also the inflexibility of some, I remember of some trade unions. I remember when we had the independence movement, and one of the demands was to shut down Fastlane, to shut down the nuclear port in next to Glasgow. And the big trade union said, we can't shut Fastlane because that's people's jobs. And somebody worked out, how many millions of pounds that was per job. It was just a ridiculous argument, but we have to move. And the trade unions can be incredibly conservative force, but they also have the potential, if pushed from below. They are the people, they have that power. And so I think a lot of it is trying to work with the trade unions and changing the nature of those unions and getting a much more bottom-up workers organizations. I'm not sure that with the Israeli example, I think Israel is just, and all that's happening in Gaza, I think understanding that and understanding the powers behind that is another example of showing how everything is linked. And I think people are beginning to make those links. You see it on the demonstrations that all these things are coming together, that we had a big demonstration to try and bring down our government here in France on Thursday, and it includes the Palestine contingent on that demonstration. People are making the links, but we need to make them more strongly.
Our next person to pose a question or make a comment is Bradley Mayer.
Good morning. My name is Bradley Mayer. I'm out here at the edge of your world in California, desperately trying to wake up. So bear with me. I'm associated politically currently with the Ukraine Solidarity Network, concerning a war that no doubt is adding greatly to the climate crisis. But I merely wanted to make a kind of economic point. I put up in the chat a link to a book that I read from cover to cover in great detail called The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. And it would be useful to have a solid economic argument for why capitalism will not carry out a transition, an energy transition to save the planet. Basically, it boils down to this. If once capitalists set up a solar array or wind generation by wind power, you're not going to extract profits from the production process of generating electricity by those means, since there's no labor power involved. So profits must be transferred from other surplus value generating industries by political means in order to cause wind power and solar power to actually be developed under a capitalist regime. And that's how I summarize what Mr. Christophers is saying. He's more of a Henry Georgian. If you know who Henry George is, he's an American from the late 19th century who wanted to abolish all land rent. So, but my view is, as I just stated, is that capitalism will never develop this because, except by political means. So the real problem, therefore, with capitalism isn't simply its economics, which we need as a basis to explain why it's a political problem, but the fact that the political regimes of world capitalism, divided into a multitude of nation states, will never be able to coordinate a worldwide, what's actually required, a worldwide implementation of non-fossil fuel energy generation.
Bradley, about 1 more minute.
Yeah, and I'm about to conclude. And that problem, that political problem, I would assert, is intimately connected up with the rise of the far right, the rise of the kind of politics we see. These are, here in the United States, we're more and more clearly seeing that the capitalist corporations are aligning themselves with Donald Trump's political program, whatever it is. And so what we're seeing politically is not accidental. This is a direct political reaction against actually carrying out a fossil fuel-free climate transition. Period. And I'll end it there.
Thank you, Bradley. Howie, and then next is Susan Caldwell, and then perhaps we'll take one more comment or question and then return to our speakers. Howie?
Yeah, I work with Bradley in the Ukraine Solidarity Network, and I think one class issue is the alliance of Trump and Putin for a climate bomb of the extraction of fossil fuels out of Russia. The minerals deal that Trump forced on Ukraine was really more about fossil fuels, certainly in the short term, than rare earth minerals. There's a lot of gas in Ukraine and the Black Sea, and those pipelines for gas and oil that cross Ukraine. Part of the minerals deal is the U.S. gets a piece of the action. And then at the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, they were talking more about fossil fuels than peace. Putin on that day issued a decree opening up Russia to Exxon and other global fossil capital corporations. And we found out a week later, the Wall Street Journal reported this, that Exxon had started negotiating with Russia about getting back into Russia as soon as Trump was inaugurated. So this is something that I think climate campaigners need to be addressing, and they're doing it in Ukraine. I'm going to put an article that warned about this happening actually early in the war by a group of Ukrainian and Russian and Polish and German leftists. And now it's coming to pass because the capitalist classes are more interested in fossil fuel than the Ukrainians. And and I'll put in another link in a minute to a campaign in Ukraine called Razom We Stand, which has been campaigning to sanction Russian fossil fuels and rebuild Ukraine and Europe and the world around renewables. So I think this is an issue that we should pay attention to, and it's part of this class struggle, the working class and the popular classes against fossil capital. So I think I just wanted to bring that to our attention.
Susan?
Hi. Yes, I think this has been a very interesting discussion. And I want to say first that I have both downloaded and read this wonderful book that the two of you have written, and I want to appreciate it. But I also had the sense of it being focused on the West, because I think I am part of an organization that is a revolutionary, eco-socialist, feminist organization, and I've been a feminist for 50 years. And I would say that the one thing that was established almost 50 years ago, and by Françoise David, was the World March for Women, which is an international organization and literally does have membership around the world, and a lot of the countries around the world still exists 50 years later. Its headquarters is now in Brazil. Was one of those who said, we're going to have to take the women, the feminist issue of the fact that women are linked with reproduction, the creation of the working class by having babies, and that's the control that was been really important and changed in the 1970s. But they have also a link with maintaining the infrastructure that is part of our lives, whether it's education, just maintaining the existence of taking care of the social issues. And that a lot of what has happened in terms of new jobs was about education, about healthcare, et cetera, which were dominantly women, and they did organize into unions. I've been a unionist for 30 years that I was teaching. I was a teacher, okay? So what I'm wanting to say is that we are facing, and what in this conversation has really brought it to, is Howie's recent thing about the Ukraine has really brought it up, is that we are in a global combat. This is not about one country or another country, it is a global thing, and we're going to have to find supports, and that's what we're doing and trying to do, is organize, make connections around with people, with organizations around the world who are taking up the issues that we support. And I think part of that is going to be the World March of Women. That's it.
Thank you, Susan. Next is Federico.
Hello, comrades. I apologize in advance because of my English. It is not very good. But I am from Marabunta, from Argentina, a political organization. I am part of what we call the Social Environmental Front. We also have a workers' front, a students' front, a cultural front, and a feminist front. And the question I ask in the chat is that we see that many of the environmental movements and struggles are organized around local struggles, and we find that it's very difficult to make a link of these local struggles to a global perspective. And the movements sometimes find very difficult to make this link. So my question was, what's your opinion about that, and how to solve this obstacle?
Thank you, Federico. Before I return to our speakers, I want to give another plug to this wonderful booklet that they've authored, which is a wonderful resource. And you can get it online. Type in Sarah Glynn and John Clarke. Climate change is a class issue, and you will find it, and you can share it with large numbers of people for free. This has been one of the most challenging forums that I've had an opportunity to be part of. A lot of sharp questions have been raised that all of us have to deal with, not simply Sarah and John, but Sarah and John are on the hot seat now, and you may have some thoughts in response to what's been raised.
And I just wanted to start with the last question from Frederico. And I think that sometimes local struggles can grow into bigger ones. And I think sometimes there are even direct links because, the things that are being the raw materials that are causing destruction one end of the world are also the ones that are feeding into the factories in the other end of the world. And so there can be very, very direct links, but also just people can see it's the same system that are causing the same problems. And certainly if you look at the website for the struggle in Florence that I mentioned, they're very, very involved in all sorts of issues, and particularly Palestine at the moment, as we all are. So, and that has really become a center actually for struggles. It's become and bringing in people from all different parts of life, and they've made academic links, they've made other links. It's become a center for an alternative politics. So I think the small struggles can create the other links, and I think that the links with women's struggle or whatever. I mean, I work with the Kurdish movement, so I'm working with a very radical feminist movement, which is about not just a feminist movement that isn't just about women doing men's jobs, but actually changing the world for everybody, which is what it should be. So I think what I really wanted to finish with was the importance of how all those small struggles can build and can learn from each other, and that actually learning, we can write a little booklet, but it's learning by doing things, by being involved. I mean, we all know it because I imagine that I'm speaking to a whole lot of activists here, that actually it's doing things, and it's even getting small victories that prove that other things are possible and that bigger things are possible. And we're taking on such an enormous thing, but actually the only way to do it is by showing that other ways are possible, by doing them and by winning those small victories and persuading more people that to change things and to be proactive about it, so that we're not just fighting, to preserve what we've got, but actually to do something better, and to see that this other way of life can be a better way of life, that if we're off that capitalist treadmill, and people can begin to realize that. But it is taking on a lot of power, and it's a huge, huge thing. But all we can do is making those small struggles, but at the same time making the links, so that the sum is bigger than the sum of the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts.
John?
Okay, well, the question was raised, of course, of capitalism and the impossibility of transition under capitalism. It was emphasized, and I think it's undeniably true, and it's the starting point for an eco-socialist perspective. Not only do you have a competitive scramble for short-term profit, and a relentless drive to accumulate regardless of consequences that's fundamentally built into the system, but you also have infrastructure and investment issues. So in the case of the fossil fuel industry, they're not ready to strand their assets, and they're not ready to move away from their massive investments. So they will literally poison us before they'll do that. I think we can just take that as indubitable, that's the system we're up against, and that's what we're challenging. And by the way, I don't wish to put forward any arguments to the proposition that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are both implicated in this and completely complicit in it. The question did come up of women's struggles and the whole climate change issue, and I mean, the reality is that given the role that social reproduction plays within capitalism, and given the historical legacies of injustice that mean that women still carry that burden to such a vastly disproportionate degree, climate change becomes utterly a way to advance and a necessity to advance women's struggles. We got an object lesson when it came to the pandemic on a global scale. The degree to which that burden was imposed on women is obvious and clear, and it won't be any different. In fact, indeed, it'll be an even more extreme situation as the climate crisis develops. Finally, with regards to local struggles and the global, I think that's a really vital question. And in some ways, it seems a difficult one to tackle because, yes, you're involved in this vigorous local struggle that's absolutely essential, and you want to be an internationalist and you want to point to, you want to show solidarity, but what does that really mean in practical terms? And it's a question that has to be addressed in the course of building a movement. But I do think that it becomes clear that there are ways in which you can make a difference. Not only do you want to promote an awareness of the global nature of the crisis and the global nature of the fight back and the absolute necessity of not making the vital struggles in the global south an oversight. Those things are absolutely clear, but there are practical ways too in which we can show support for each other. I mean, not on a climate issue, but a number of years ago, with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, was contacted by a group of striking workers in Sri Lanka. And they were up against the Baugher shoe company, an absolutely outrageous bunch of exploiters who are based in Canada. And they have this preposterous shoe museum in Toronto. And so we occupied the shoe museum in solidarity with the Sri Lankan workers. And they were prepared to send the riot cops in against the Sri Lankan workers, but that their prestigious nonsensical shoe museum should be disrupted was so horrific that they began negotiations again the next day with the union in Sri Lanka. So I mean, those kinds of things are those kinds of ways of building practical international solidarity are very real, but we have to look for them. We have to seek to put them forward. In the case of the global south right now, there's more floods in Pakistan, for God's sake. And you've got a situation where the country is not only flooded, but it's choking in debt. And the notion that meeting the needs of people who are dying in floods should be less important than the interest payments going to a cocktail lounge full of financiers is obscene. And that's something we can raise and something that will resonate. So I think there are real ways of building global solidarity in the course of building this movement.
Thank you, John. We are close to the end of the forum. Before I call on Mark, who I see your hand is up, I want to emphasize that a recording of this forum will be available in a couple of weeks from the Mark's Mail YouTube channel. And hopefully shortly after that, it will be on the website of the Global Eco-Socialist Network. And it seems to me that the discussion that's taken place so far has been extremely important, but it needs to go on. It's a collective grappling with the problems that all of us are facing. Mark?
I wanted to add that I do think we need to have more discussion on how to take these local movements and integrate them globally. And I think I always thought Jen has a role in this. So I do think we should start talking about taking the next step, because what we have is a highly distributed, splintered movement that's fighting capital in a very distributed way, but they have centralized power. And I do think that I'd like to understand how we can come together internationally to fight that. And thanks very much to the speakers, and we will be putting together the video within a week or two.
Now, by the way, Jen, you might be wondering who she is. It's Global Eco-Socialist Network that Mark was talking about, which has the kind of role to play that he has mentioned, which is daunting. But in any event, I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. And at this point, we'll call this forum to a close. And let's keep on talking and keep on struggling. That's it.